It may not be the first thing that comes to mind when thinking of a luster, but it's actually one of the strongest subclasses out there for many classes. On top of that, a luster sub increases the viability of Gunblade usage on lots of classes that would normally overlook it too. Now, to understand what a luster subclass brings to the table, we should first jump right into its skill tree. But before getting into it, it should first be mentioned that you definitely can use a luster main class skill tree build as a subclass tree, but as usual, if you want to get the most out of it, you would ideally want to buy an additional luster skill tree and then use that as your luster sub tree. Now, I did purposely leave a lot of skill points out of this slide just to show a bare bones build to give you an idea of where to start, but just take whatever points you have left over and then just throw them really wherever else you want. For right now, let's just use this slide for the main takeaways. Though, if you want an entire breakdown of how every luster skill works, I spent about 8 minutes going over the entire tree near the beginning of my main class luster video. So with that all said, first off, the main pros would be extremely high unconditional damage, especially melee damage, longer shifta and deband duration and max duration, faster focus and photon blast accumulation, increased gunblade damage based off main class. It can use any offensive power stat mag regardless of your main class, and it also works well with status builds too. After that, its arguably most important features are somewhat to highly conditional. Voltage in its entirety offers extra damage, damage reduction, crit rate, shifta and deband, and even cooldown reductions. But it also revolves around constantly attacking and striving to get to and stay over 500 voltage, which is considered high voltage. That all being said, it's not that bad, but it's still conditional, and it's not always that feasible for every class. Next, high combo variant PP save allows you to have insane PP economy, but you need to keep using up to 3 or 4 different PAs or techs consistently to make full use of this. But for some classes, this really isn't too feasible or will require you to really change up how you play because some classes really just rely on that 1 or 2 really strong PA along with counters. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Bravers. And for the last conditional skill, there's Tech Art's Perfect Attack multi-bonus, which requires you to constantly perfect attack different PAs or techs back to back to gain more crit rate and voltage accumulation. And this might be a bit of a turnoff to a lot of people who don't want to have to always perfect attack a lot, or especially perfect attack different PAs or techs back to back consistently, but if you really want to get the most out of this sub, and you want to get that easy crit rate and rack up that voltage much faster, you will need to make full use of this skill. Now moving on to a luster sub's main disadvantages, the first would be that it does not offer access to techniques whatsoever. So if you do want to use techs, your main class is going to have to be a tech user. And the other notable downside of a luster sub is that it doesn't really offer any protections or safety nets outside of the voltage damage reduction, which again only maxes at 20% damage reduction when your voltage is at 500, which isn't that hard to do again, but it's still conditional. So if you're fine with all those conditions and those few downsides, then it's a really awesome subclass. If not, then it might just not be the sub for you. Taking everything into account so far, almost any class can take advantage of some, if not most of what a luster sub has to offer. But for some classes, it still generally may not be as worth it versus some other subclass options you have out there. So that being said, the classes that would benefit the most from a luster subclass while using their own class-specific weapons would be Hunter, Fighter, Bouncer, Techter, and sometimes Bowbraver. Starting with the Hunter, there's just so much that it gains from a luster sub. The first thing that comes to mind is the very, very high melee multipliers, which is again a 70% unconditional melee multiplier right off the bat. However, after that, voltage can give up to another 10% damage and 20% damage reduction, which is nowhere close to what an A12 sub can give, but it's still something, and it works well with guard stance. And speaking of voltage, when in high voltage, you'll be able to keep the buff Hunter Physique up a lot more. On top of that, since Hunter uses the focus mechanic, the shifta gauge boost will help that build up even faster too. Now, due to each of the Hunter's weapons having different attack speeds, some can build up voltage faster than others. However, in general, all 3 of the Hunter's weapons can benefit from a luster sub. For example, the Partisan may not accumulate voltage as fast as the Wired Lance. However, with just the skill Tech Art's PP high save, the Partisan's PP hungry nature can be greatly reduced. That all being said, at the end of the day, an A12 sub will likely be a better choice overall for a Hunter, but a luster sub will potentially offer more DPS. Next up, we have the Fighter, which will of course love the extremely high melee multipliers and the extra crit rate. And due to fighters already weaving different PAs back to back for their version of Tech Art's bonus, they will easily be able to make use of both of Luster's Tech Art skills. However, to make full use of Luster's multi-bonus, they will need to add 1 or 2 more PAs to their usual rotations. After that, Voltage will give them a little bit more damage reduction, which may end up saving them when in overload. Voltage will also then consistently proc Shift and Deband for them, which will allow them to make more use of status builds, since both Luster and Fighters have skills in their trees to help proc statuses. them being Demand Disorder for Luster and the Half-Line and Chaser skills for Fighter. Last but surely not least, when in high voltage, fighters will also have 100% uptime on their overload. Though, as mentioned before, one big downside to consider with a Luster sub is that it offers no added protections or safety nets outside of that 20% damage reduction. Whereas if you were to still use a Hunter sub, you could sometimes rely on that Iron Will to save you. Now with all that said, it's generally recommended to use a double saber when using a Luster sub for a fighter, as it first off does a lot of hits very fast, thus racking up voltage very efficiently, whereas other fighter weapons are significantly slower at this. After that, it also has some defensive capabilities built into its PAs, and it's a pretty all-rounded weapon. Moving on to bouncers, they first off really benefit from the auto-casting of Shifta and Deband since some of their skills rely heavily on having those buffs up constantly. They then also benefit from the high melee power bonus, additional crit rate, PP cost reduction, and of course damage reduction. However, the main reason to seek out a Luster sub on a bouncer main is to have 100% uptime on their Photon Blade Fever buff, which is attainable when in high voltage, which again is when your voltage is over 500. Luckily, bouncers have a very high hit rate, and can also take advantage of ramming at 0 to rack up voltage even faster when in close range. Even so, this pairing is still a bit situational, and works best in more drawn-out fights, and or in solo gameplay where you can keep your voltage going for a long time. When it comes to Techter, a Luster sub for non-Gunblade usage is still great, but they mainly take a Luster sub to open up the usage of Gunblades, but we'll be getting more into that in the next section. Anyways, there's still a lot of synergy between the two classes' trees. First off, you get the extremely high melee multipliers from Luster, but at the same time also decent tech multipliers too, meaning you can play melee or hybrid. After that, voltage is always nice for the added damage and damage reduction, but more importantly, allows you to forego the need to recast Shifta and Deband on yourself when solo, so long as you're attacking. As mentioned a moment ago, an easy way to build up voltage faster on melee casters is to make full use of the tech ramming at 0, though you will need to be in melee range to use this. Of course, techers can take advantage of most of what a Luster sub offers, but the last main benefit that really stands out is that they can easily make use of Luster's Deband Disorder to apply statuses more easily to their wand explosions. Now with Techter, as far as comparing a Luster sub to say a Phantom or a Twal sub, a Phantom sub will give you faster cast speed and unconditional PP cost reduction, and then a Twal sub will make you a lot tankier. However, a Luster sub offers techers the highest possible melee DPS of all three. The last non-Gunblade pairing I'd like to mention today is Bow Braver. Now, this pairing isn't necessarily better than Braver Phantom or Braver Twal, but gives you a little bit of both worlds. You'd mostly be taking a Luster sub in this case for all the benefits that voltage brings, but mainly for the crit rate, damage reduction, and cooldown reduction for skills like Rapid Shoot and Katana Combat. The addition of being able to Shifta and Deband yourself and even remove statuses when reaching high voltage is just icing on the cake. We then have Luster's Tech Art skills. Multi-bonus is nice for crit rate, but the Tech Art's PP save will likely require you to change up some of your combos to make full use of it. All in all, a Luster sub can work out decently well for a Bow Braver, but really requires you to be reaching that high voltage fast, and then maintaining it. But you could argue to a degree that's the case with almost any combination that uses a Luster sub. Now when it comes to class pairings that will benefit the most from using a Luster sub, with the intent of making full use of the Gunblade, it ends up being the same classes we just mentioned in the last section, minus Bouncer. But let's quickly run through why they also work well with the Gunblade. As it is, fighters have been using Gunblades even before Luster came out due to them having high multipliers, and also using Overload to amp up the damage to make them even more viable. Now with a Luster sub, we have even more base damage to Gunblades, and the ability to be an Overload 100% of the time due to high voltage, thus making Gunblades completely viable. Next, with Hunter, no matter how you currently build it, you can add a Gunblade to your existing setup and it will likely work out great. If you currently like using guard stance, you can actually proc it through Gunblade PAs that have block frames. And if you don't like to have conditions on your multipliers, you can still use Fury stance too. And no matter which stance you use, you can still make use of all of Hunter's defensive skills like Massive Hunter and Flash Guards, and all their safety nets such as Automate and Iron Will. With Techter, you get all the utility that it normally brings, such as techs for grouping, mobility, and healing, and then its enhanced buffs to offense, defense, and HP. This effectively allows you to contribute to a party in just about all the same ways you would before with a wand, but lets you change it up a little bit and use a more single target based weapon. Since the Gunblade Photon Arts have lots of guard frames, this breathes new life into Techter gameplay, especially solo gameplay. And lastly, Braver can do pretty well with the Gunblades as well, due to them having high multipliers with Precision Stance. However, this combo would generally be reserved for specific boss fights in which weak spots are consistently exposed so they can make use of the aforementioned Precision Stance. Before we wrap things up, if you're interested in Gunblade usage, I have an entire video going over all the Gunblade Photon Arts. and even have some starter combos at the end of that video too, that take using a lesser subclass into consideration. And if you really want to dive deeper into Gunblade usage, check out the links I left in the description, as there are some pretty amazing Gunblade focused written guides out there that cover literally everything you'd want to know about them. So I'll leave you guys with that for now, and until next time, go luster yourself.